Hi, and a good day, everyone. I hope you are all doing well. Our topic for this week is phylogenetic relationships of terrestrial vertebrates. So, we will be discussing species concepts and basis for establishing phylogenetic relationships, which were scheduled for weeks 8 and 9, respectively. Let us begin with this biodiversity fact check from BCSP, or the Biodiversity Conservation Society of the Philippines. And that is that the word species, whether singular or plural, is pronounced as species. So tandaan at ating ipatanda sa mga di nakakaalam na kahit ilang species pa yan, may S pa rin sa dulo. If you read the definition of species here, it says there that a species is a group of closely related organisms that are very similar to each other and are usually capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. As biologists, we are naturally inclined to count how many species there are, whether living or extinct, since this is the measure of the diversity of life. But this is not an easy question to answer. Not that we can count, but rather because there are various species concepts now, and we will discuss this later. Species is the fundamental unit of life, so we count biodiversity as to how many species of living organisms there are. In systematics, the diversification in lineages through time is studied. Evolutionary biology, on the other hand, studies the evolutionary processes that produced the diversity of life. Ernst Mayr writes, "In The Origin of the Species of Darwin, the species is the principal unit of evolution. A sound understanding of the biological nature of species is fundamental to writing about evolution and indeed about almost any aspect of the philosophy of biology. I define biological species as groups of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups." Ernst Mayr wrote about how different investigators approached species identification, and he characterized their approaches as species concepts. Mayr's book on the systematics and the origin of species represents a self-conscious effort to explicate the significance of population variation in the understanding of evolutionary processes and the origin of new species. He argued for what came to be called the biological species concept, that a species consists of populations of organisms that can reproduce with one another and that are reproductively isolated from other populations. Though he was not the first to define species on the basis of reproductive compatibility. Based on the previous theories and with more studies, taxonomists have proposed different approaches of species concepts in modern science. To approach a satisfactory and acceptable classification, the relationship between individuals should be considered. These relations could be phenetic or phylogenetic. The term phenetic is applied to classification system, which relies on similarities between present properties of organisms with no consideration or references in how they possess them. Morphology, cytology, phytochemistry, anatomy, embryology, and even some generic features are considered to be source data for phenetic characteristics. On the other hand, when the relationship describes the pathways of ancestry, it is called cladistic, which is the same as phylogenetic. Listed here are some of the other species concepts and the properties that are measured. Just as extinction is a natural process, so is speciation. It most likely occurs when populations become geographically isolated from one another. When populations are separated, they may diverge from one another morphologically, genetically, or both. These changes might occur by natural selection or by random chance, and in both cases result in reproductive isolation. This view of speciation of geographically isolated populations, termed allopatric speciation, is still widely held among speciation biologists as playing a major role in the evolution of biodiversity. However, speciation might also occur sympatrically. The main difference between allopatric speciation and peripatric speciation is that in peripatric speciation, one group is much smaller than the other. In peripatric speciation, a species is spread out over a large geographic area. Although it is possible for any member of the species to mate with another member, individuals only mate with those in their own geographic region. Natural selection is generally recognized as a central mechanism of evolutionary change within species. Thus, natural selection plays a major role in generating the array of phenotypic and genetic diversity observed in nature. But to what extent is selection also responsible for the formation of new species? To what extent do new phenotypic and genetic characters arise via natural selection? Populations living in different ecological environments might undergo divergent and adaptive evolutionary change via divergent natural selection. Adaptation to different environments might cause differences between populations in the way individuals tend to look, smell, and behave, and may cause individuals from different populations to avoid mating with one another. According to De Quiros, the paper I asked you to read, these species concepts exhibit an underlying conceptual unity, which provides the basis for a unified concept of species. And this is that the concept of species as separately evolving metapopulation lineages. In this context, any property that provides evidence of lineage separation is relevant to inferring the boundaries and numbers of species. This diagram represents a single lineage splitting to form two lineages. The gradations in shades of gray represent the daughter lineages diverging through time and the different properties they acquire. This set of properties forms a gray zone, and this is where the various species concepts come into conflict. So on either side of the gray zone, there will be unanimous agreement about the number of species. Before the acquisition of the first property, everyone will agree that there is a single species. And after the acquisition of the last property, everyone will agree that there are two. In between, however, there will be disagreement. So again, theoretically, there is an agreement that species are separately evolving metapopulation lineages. And again, the disagreement lies in the evidences, for example, the reliability of the methods and how lineage separation can be inferred from the data that are derived. Cases of incomplete lineage separation, for example, is the subspecies. The subspecies are populations of a species living in different subdivisions of the species range and varying from one another by morphological characteristics. ESUs, or evolutionarily significant units, on the other hand, are populations of organisms that is considered distinct for purposes of conservation. Delineating ESUs is important when considering conservation action. The term can be applied to any species, subspecies, geographic race, or population. Phylogenetics plays a key role in how wildlife species are delimited. Phylogenetics is a branch of systematics that deals with the study of relationships among or within groups of organisms. Current species concepts use phylogeny in species delimitation, or better yet, De Quiros would argue that a current tool used for species delimitation is phylogenetics. So these relationships are are hypothesized by evaluating heritable traits. And in terms of these relationships, only monophyletic taxa should be recognized as named groups. Cladistics reflects phylogeny in its classifications by only recognizing groups based on shared, derived characters or synapomorphisms. Evolutionary taxonomy considers both branching pattern and degree of difference. So just to review, cladistics is the method of hypothesizing relationships among organisms. So it's a method of reconstructing evolutionary trees. The basis of cladistic analysis would be data on characters or traits of organisms. Characters could be anatomical and physiological characteristics, behaviors, or genetic sequences. A tree is the result of a cladistic analysis, and it represents a supported hypothesis about the relationships among the organisms analyzed. Resulting trees depend on the quality of data. New and better data could change outcome of a cladistic analysis, supporting a different hypothesis about how organisms are related. It is only when characteristics change that we are able to recognize different lineages or groups. Original state of the characteristic is also referred to as plesiomorphic characters, while changed state will refer to the apomorphic characters. So again, in cladistics, the emphasis is on producing a monophyletic grouping. It is a shared, derived character that defines a clade. This method is the one currently accepted by most taxonomists. In cladistics, there are three basic assumptions. So one is that change in characteristics occurs in lineages over time. The assumption that characteristics of organisms change over time is the most important one in cladistics. The second assumption is that any group of organism is related by descent from a common ancestor. The third assumption is that there is a bifurcating or branching pattern of lineage splitting. Of course, this assumption suggests that when a lineage splits, it divides into exactly two groups. There are some situations, of course, that violate this assumption. For your learning activity, so please read the attached paper, The Phylogenetic Position of the Recently Rediscovered Philippine Forest Turtle, Bataguridae Heosemis latensis, and then discuss the important points of the paper in terms of the phylogenetic relationship of the Philippine forest turtle. So you are going to submit a one-page report for this. So that's all. So you may proceed with your learning activity. Have a nice week.